Number 1. The Emergency Powers Gambit. Let me paint you a picture of the most brilliant political checkmate in galactic history. While we often think of Palpatine as this cackling, lightning-shooting villain, his real superpower was understanding something most tyrants miss. Democracies don't die in dramatic coups. They sign their own death warrants with binding documents. And Palpatine, he wrote every single one. The groundwork began in 32 BBY when Senator Palpatine orchestrated the Trade Federation's blockade of Naboo. This wasn't just about causing chaos. It exposed a critical flaw in the Republic's constitution. The Republic had become so bureaucratic, so tangled in committees and procedures, that it literally couldn't respond to emergencies. Supreme Chancellor Finis Valorum was paralyzed by endless debates while Naboo suffered. And this legislative gridlock became Palpatine's opening move. When Palpatine assumed the chancellorship after Valorum's removal, he inherited a government that everyone agreed was broken. The Senate recognized they needed reform, and Palpatine was more than happy to provide it. Over the next decade, he carefully cultivated the image of a reluctant leader burdened by an ineffective system. Every speech, every public appearance reinforced the same message. The Republic's institutions were failing, and only decisive action could save them. Then came 22 BBY and the Separatist crisis. Thousands of star systems were threatening secession under Count Dooku's leadership, and the Senate faced an existential question they'd never had to answer. What happens when peaceful democracy is threatened by those who reject it entirely? Palpatine had engineered a scenario where the Republic's own principles became its weakness. They valued debate and diplomacy so highly that they had no framework for rapid military response. This is where Palpatine's trap snapped shut. In an emergency session, Senator Jar Jar Binks, of all people, proposed granting Supreme Chancellor Palpatine emergency powers to deal with the Separatist threat. Now here's the beautiful irony. Binks was manipulated by Palpatine's allies while the senator thought he was saving the Republic. The motion passed with thunderous applause, as Padme Amidala would later recall with bitter irony. The Senate didn't vote to end democracy. They voted to temporarily suspend certain processes to save democracy. It was constitutional, procedural, and catastrophic. These emergency powers allowed Palpatine to bypass Senate approval for military decisions, make unilateral executive appointments, and redirect Republic resources without the usual oversight committees. The kicker? There was no sunset clause, no automatic expiration date. The Senate assumed they could simply revoke them once the crisis ended. What they didn't realize was that Palpatine would ensure the crisis never ended. Here's where you need to grab your hype and support this channel, because understanding how Palpatine weaponized fear requires us to examine the slow erosion of rights that most citizens barely noticed. Number 2. The Clone Army's authorization. Now let's talk about the most expensive loophole in history: the Grand Army of the Republic. The creation of the Clone Army represents one of Palpatine's most audacious manipulations because he got the Jedi themselves to authorize it. We learn in Attack of the Clones that the army was commissioned roughly 10 years earlier by Jedi Master Sifo-Dyas. But here's what makes this brilliant. Sifo-Dyas acted without official Jedi Council authorization. Yet the Republic never questioned the army's legitimacy when they desperately needed it. As revealed in the Clone Wars animated series, Sifo-Dyas genuinely believed the Republic would need an army and commissioned it from the Kaminoans before his death. But Palpatine and Count Dooku intercepted this arrangement. They didn't need to forge documents or create an illegal army. They just co-opted an existing order. Dooku eliminated Sifo-Dyas, worked with the Kaminoans to ensure the clones would have inhibitor chips installed, and essentially hijacked a legitimate military contract. When the clone army was discovered on Kamino, the Republic faced a choice: reject this mysterious army and face the Separatist droid forces unprepared, or accept this convenient solution despite its murky origins. The Senate chose survival over scrutiny, bringing the army into service as the war began. Palpatine didn't break any laws here. He exploited the Republic's desperate need to rationalize a military force they couldn't afford to refuse. What's particularly insidious is how the clone army structure gave Palpatine complete control. As Supreme Chancellor with emergency powers, he became the army's commander-in-chief. The Jedi were appointed as generals, yes, but they served at the Chancellor's pleasure. Every clone's chain of command ultimately led back to Palpatine's office. The Republic Senate believed they had authorized a defensive force, but the actual framework created a personal army answerable only to the Chancellor. The funding mechanism was equally clever. Palpatine pushed through legislation dramatically increasing military spending and giving the Chancellor's office authority to redirect funds without standard appropriations processes. He argued, quite reasonably, that you can't fight a war with peacetime bureaucracy. The Senate agreed, not realizing they were funding their own demise. Every credit spent on clone trooper armor, every ship commissioned for the Republic Navy, was legally authorized spending that built Palpatine's instrument of tyranny. Number 3. Wartime constitutional erosion. The Clone Wars lasted 3 years, and during that time, Palpatine systematically dismantled the Republic's constitutional protections through legislation. The Sector Governance Decree, passed near the end of the war around 19 BBY, reorganized the Republic into regional sectors with governors appointed directly by the Chancellor. The Senate sold this as a wartime efficiency measure, cutting through bureaucracy to coordinate defense efforts. What they actually did was replace elected representation with Palpatine's appointees. Various security acts expanded the Chancellor's apparatus dramatically. Palpatine created new intelligence agencies, surveillance networks, and enforcement divisions, all operating under emergency war powers. Republic intelligence was restructured and placed under direct executive control, meaning Palpatine had authority to spy on anyone, including senators, in the name of rooting out separatist infiltrators. One of the most chilling examples comes from the Clone Wars series. The hunt for separatist conspirators on Coruscant led to laws allowing indefinite detention without trial. Senator Bail Organa objected, arguing these measures violated fundamental rights, but he was shouted down by fear. After all, how could they protect civil liberties when the separatists might strike at any moment? Each restriction was presented as temporary, each new power as necessary for victory, and each one was approved by the Senate itself. Palpatine also manipulated the Jedi Order's standing with surgical precision. The Jedi had always operated with significant autonomy, but as the war progressed, Palpatine passed legislation that placed them more firmly under executive oversight. The Jedi Council found themselves having to report to the Chancellor's office, justify their operations, and accept non-Jedi oversight of their activities. This wasn't presented as restricting the Jedi. It was framed as coordination and accountability during wartime. The Jedi, committed to serving the Republic, accepted these changes because they were mandates from the government they'd sworn to serve. The brilliant part is that every single one of these measures had a kernel of legitimate justification. The separatists were real. The threat was genuine. The Republic was fighting for its survival. Palpatine didn't need to fabricate crises when he'd engineered a real war with himself, controlling both sides. Every expansion of executive power was voted on by the Senate. Every restriction of liberty was authorized through proper channels. The Republic didn't fall to a coup. It transformed itself into a dictatorship through lawful processes. Number 4. Order 66's legal framework. Now we reach the most devastating example of Palpatine's manipulation, Order 66 itself. When we watch Revenge of the Sith and see clone troopers suddenly execute their Jedi commanders, it feels like a betrayal, a military coup. But here's the nightmare reality. Order 66 was a legitimate military order, authorized by existing Republic law. The contingency orders, of which Order 66 was just one among many, were protocols built into the Grand Army's command structure from day one. These weren't secret assassination directives. They were official emergency procedures designed for various catastrophic scenarios. Order 65, for example, called for the removal of the Supreme Chancellor if he was deemed unfit. Each order addressed a specific crisis scenario where normal command structure might break down. Order 66 specifically addressed the scenario of Jedi officers committing treason against the Republic. And here's where Palpatine's framework becomes terrifyingly elegant. As Commander-in-Chief during a state of emergency, the Supreme Chancellor had authority to issue contingency orders without Senate approval. He could declare any individual or group a threat to the Republic and authorize immediate military action. The clones weren't violating orders when they executed the Jedi. They were following authorized military commands. The inhibitor chips that controlled clone behavior, revealed in the Clone Wars, add another layer to this. The Kaminoans installed these chips under the guise of behavioral modification to prevent clone independence and aggression. When questioned, they presented the chips as ensuring clone loyalty and stability, framed as a quality control measure in their military contract. The Republic medical authorities who examined clones never thoroughly investigated the chip's full functionality because they trusted the Kaminoans' official documentation. Everything was above board, filed in proper reports, authorized through contracts. When Palpatine issued Order 66, he did so as the head of state, declaring the Jedi Order guilty of treason. His evidence, the attempted arrest by Mace Windu and several other Jedi Masters, which he characterized as a coup attempt. From a purely legal standpoint, Jedi warriors attacking the Supreme Chancellor in his office could absolutely be construed as insurrection. Never mind that the Jedi had legitimate concerns about Palpatine being a Sith Lord. Legally, they'd drawn weapons on the elected head of government without presenting charges through proper channels. The Senate received reports that the Jedi had attempted to overthrow the Republic, supported by emergency communications from the Chancellor's office. Those senators who might have questioned the narrative were either Palpatine's allies or too frightened by the apparent Jedi coup to object. The extermination of the Jedi Order proceeded with the full weight of Republic law behind it. No illegal death squads, no secret purges, just military forces executing orders to eliminate treasonous officers. Number 5. The Empire's legal birth. The transformation from Republic to Empire represents the culmination of Palpatine's strategy, and it happened through a constitutional process, not a violent overthrow. When Palpatine addressed the Senate in revenge of the Sith declaring the formation of the Galactic Empire, he didn't seize power. He accepted it when the Senate offered it to him. His speech framed everything masterfully. The Republic had been under siege by separatists. The Jedi, supposedly guardians of peace, had revealed themselves as traitors attempting to seize control. The war was over, but the Republic was broken, corrupted, inefficient. What the galaxy needed wasn't the failed democratic system that had allowed these crises to emerge, but a strong, centralized government that could actually protect its citizens. And the Senate agreed. The vote to reorganize the Republic into the Galactic Empire passed through proper procedure. Senators like Bail Organa and Mon Mothma objected, recognizing they were witnessing democracy's death, but they were outvoted. The majority of senators, driven by fear of continued instability and convinced by years of Palpatine's careful manipulation, granted him supreme authority. They gave him the title of Emperor. They approved the reorganization of government structures, and they did it all constitutionally. Palpatine's genius was making them think it was their idea. He'd spent 3 years gradually expanding his authority, each time promising these were temporary measures. By the time he declared the Empire, those temporary powers had become the status quo. The Senate had grown accustomed to Palpatine making unilateral decisions. They'd accepted that emergency circumstances required strong executive action. The formal declaration of the Empire simply acknowledged the reality that Palpatine already controlled everything. The framework Palpatine established made opposition incredibly difficult. He didn't need to outlaw dissent immediately because he'd made dissent legally dangerous. Questioning the Emperor could be construed as supporting the separatist cause or sympathizing with the treasonous Jedi. The vast surveillance network built during the war meant potential rebels could be identified and arrested for legitimate violations. Palpatine didn't need to create arbitrary laws to suppress opposition. He'd already built a system where opposition was inherently criminal. Number 6. Constitutional amendments cemented. The final phase of Palpatine's coup involved restructuring the Empire's constitutional foundation to ensure his authority couldn't be challenged through procedural means. The Imperial Charter, ratified by the Senate shortly after the Empire's declaration, fundamentally rewrote how power operated in the galaxy while maintaining the appearance of lawful governance. One of the most significant changes was the complete reorganization of the legislative branch. The Imperial Senate remained, but its powers were systematically reduced through constitutional amendments that the Senate itself approved. The Emperor gained authority to dismiss senators, to appoint replacements for entire planetary delegations, and to dissolve Senate sessions at will. Each change was presented as necessary for security and efficiency, and each was ratified. The regional governors established earlier became the Moffs, and later Grand Moffs, who wielded direct imperial authority over entire sectors of space. These weren't military dictators operating outside the law. They were appointed officials working within an established chain of command. Their authority came from imperial law, codified in documents the Senate had approved. When Governor Tarkin ordered the destruction of Alderaan in A New Hope, he was exercising authority granted to him by the imperial government structure. Palpatine also reformed the justice system, creating imperial courts that operated under new codes, emphasizing order and security over individual rights. The principles of due process were maintained in theory, but undermined in practice through exceptions for threats to imperial security. This wasn't lawless tyranny. It was tyranny operating through corrupted but technically functional systems. Defendants had rights, they could access counsel and present evidence, but the laws themselves were written to favor the Empire's interests. The brilliance of Palpatine's framework was its self-perpetuating nature. By the time heroes like Luke Skywalker began fighting the Empire, They weren't battling an illegal regime that could be overthrown by restoring legitimate government. They were fighting a government that was, by its own standards, completely legitimate. The Rebel Alliance had to position themselves as revolutionaries creating a new government, not restorers of the old one, because the Republic had transformed itself into the Empire through constitutional means. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Palpatine's rise to power. He understood that laws are just tools, and in the hands of someone patient and ruthless enough to spend decades positioning pieces on the board, those tools can build a prison that entire civilizations walk into willingly. The Republic's laws, designed to protect freedom and democracy, became the very instruments of its destruction. Every emergency power, every expansion of executive authority was debated and approved by representatives who believed they were saving the Republic. They didn't realize they were dismantling it piece by piece, signing documents that transferred their power to a Sith Lord who played the long game better than anyone in galactic history. The Empire wasn't built on the Republic's ashes. It was built with the Republic's own laws, transformed brick by brick into something unrecognizable. And that's far more terrifying than any sudden coup could ever be. If you loved this deep dive into Palpatine's political genius, hit that hype button to show your support.